There's a specific kind of disorientation that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. One that has nothing to do with sadness or happiness or any single identifiable emotion, and everything to do with something far more unsettling. The experience of sitting with a feeling, trying to name it, and coming up completely empty, not because nothing is there, but because whatever is there has become genuinely unreadable, even to you. If you've ever been asked, "How are you feeling right now?" and found yourself staring blankly, unable to produce an honest answer despite knowing something is clearly happening beneath the surface, I want you to know today that this isn't emotional emptiness, isn't a sign that you've become cold or disconnected. It's something far more specific, far more psychological, and understanding what's actually happening changes everything about how you approach getting your emotional clarity back. Let's start with something that needs to be named plainly, because it reframes the entire conversation. Losing access to your own emotional language is not the same thing as losing your emotions themselves. This distinction matters enormously, because so many people who experience this specific disorientation assume the problem is that they've stopped feeling things, when what's actually happened is something different and, in many ways, more fixable. The emotions are still there, still being generated, still influencing your body, your decisions, your reactions to the world around you. What's missing is the internal translation system, the mechanism that takes raw physiological and psychological signals and converts them into language you can actually recognize, name, and communicate. When that translation system becomes overwhelmed or damaged, the feelings don't disappear. They simply arrive without labels, like mail delivered in a language you no longer read fluently, still containing real information, still demanding some kind of response, but no longer legible in the way it once was. The first reason this happens, and one of the most common, is chronic emotional suppression that eventually crosses a threshold into genuine dissociation from your own internal signals. This isn't the same as simply being private about your emotions or choosing not to express them openly. It's a much deeper pattern, one that usually develops over years, where you learned, for whatever reason, that acknowledging certain feelings, even privately, even just to yourself, wasn't safe or wasn't allowed. Maybe you grew up in an environment where certain emotions were met with punishment, dismissal, or ridicule, and you learned to intercept those feelings before they could even fully register, redirecting your attention elsewhere before the emotion had the chance to be named. Over years of doing this, the interception process becomes so automatic, so unconscious, that you eventually lose access not just to expressing the emotion, but to recognizing it in the first place. The suppression didn't just hide the feeling from other people. It hid the feeling from you. The second reason involves something more physiological, and it has to do with what happens to emotional processing when your nervous system has been operating in a state of chronic stress or hypervigilance for an extended period. When your body is consistently flooded with stress hormones, consistently primed for threat detection rather than nuanced emotional processing, the specific brain regions responsible for fine-grained emotional differentiation, the ability to distinguish between disappointment and sadness, between irritation and genuine anger, between anxiety and excitement, which physiologically overlap significantly, start to function less effectively. Under chronic stress, your nervous system essentially simplifies its output, collapsing the rich, specific vocabulary of emotion into a much narrower range, often just fine or not fine, okay or overwhelmed. Because fine-grained differentiation requires cognitive and neurological resources that chronic stress systematically redirects elsewhere, toward pure survival functioning rather than nuanced self-understanding. The third reason is something that develops specifically in people who've spent extended periods prioritizing everyone else's emotional experience over their own, a pattern we've discussed at length in previous conversations about empaths and people-pleasing more broadly. When you spend years directing your attention outward, constantly monitoring other people's moods, needs, and reactions, the internal muscle required for monitoring your own emotional state atrophies from sheer disuse. This isn't a permanent loss of capacity. Muscles that atrophy from disuse can be rebuilt. But it does mean that if you've spent a significant portion of your life as the designated emotional reader of everyone around you, the skill of reading yourself with that same attentiveness may have simply never had the chance to develop fully, or may have developed and then withered from years of being consistently deprioritized in favor of managing everyone else's internal world instead. The fourth reason, and this one is worth taking seriously, involves the specific effect of prolonged emotional overwhelm on the nervous system's willingness to generate clear signals at all. Sometimes, when someone experiences an extended period of intense, difficult emotion, grief, heartbreak, chronic anxiety, sustained conflict, the nervous system essentially learns that clear emotional signals lead to unbearable experiences, and it starts, protectively, to blur those signals before they reach conscious awareness, as a way of preventing the full intensity of what's underneath from becoming consciously accessible all at once. This is a genuinely protective mechanism, not a malfunction, even though it produces an experience that feels confusing and disorienting from the inside. Your nervous system isn't failing you by making your emotions harder to read. In many cases, it's protecting you from processing more than you currently have the capacity to safely handle, buying time until enough stability returns that fuller access can be restored without becoming overwhelming. The fifth reason involves something more specific to modern life, and it's worth naming directly because it rarely gets discussed in conversations about emotional awareness. The sheer volume of external stimulation most people are exposed to on a daily basis, which leaves very little quiet space for the kind of internal listening that emotional recognition actually requires. Emotions, especially subtle or complex ones, often need a certain amount of unstimulated internal quiet in order to surface clearly enough to be named. If your days are filled almost entirely with external input, constant notifications, constant content, constant low-grade stimulation from screens and noise, and other people's opinions, there's simply very little space left for the internal quiet that allows a feeling to fully form and become recognizable before the next piece of stimulation arrives and pulls your attention elsewhere. Over time, this creates a kind of chronic interruption pattern, where emotions never get the sustained internal attention required to be fully processed and named, leaving you with a persistent, low-grade sense that something is happening internally that you simply haven't had the space to identify. The sixth reason, and this one deserves real, honest attention, is the specific confusion that develops after a period of significant identity change or upheaval, when the emotional responses you used to be able to predict and recognize in yourself no longer match who you're currently becoming. If you've gone through a major life transition, a breakup, a career change, a shift in values, a period of genuine personal growth, your emotional responses to familiar situations may have genuinely changed, even while your internal expectation of how you're supposed to feel hasn't caught up yet. This creates a specific kind of static, where you reach for an old, familiar label for an emotion, and it simply doesn't fit anymore, because the person having the emotion has changed, even though the internal reference library you're drawing from hasn't been updated to reflect that change. This isn't emotional confusion in the sense of something being wrong. It's actually evidence of growth outpacing your language for describing it. A genuinely different, more hopeful kind of confusion than the other patterns we've discussed today. I want to pause here and say something important about why this experience, regardless of which of these 6 reasons is driving it in your specific case, tends to feel so uniquely distressing compared to other forms of emotional difficulty. Most emotional pain, however intense, at least comes with the clarity of knowing what you're dealing with. You know you're sad, you know you're angry, you know you're afraid, even if you don't know exactly what to do about it. Losing access to that basic clarity is disorienting in a different, arguably more unsettling way, because it removes the foundation that most emotional processing depends on. You can't fully process what you can't identify. You can't communicate what you can't name. And this creates a specific kind of isolation, because even the people who genuinely want to support you can't offer much help when your honest answer to "How are you feeling?" is simply "I don't know." An answer that, however true, tends to end conversations rather than deepen them, leaving you to sit with the confusion largely alone, precisely when connection might actually help the most. There's also something worth naming about the shame that often accompanies this experience, because it compounds the disorientation in a way that makes the whole situation significantly harder to navigate. A lot of people who lose access to their emotional clarity interpret this loss as a personal failing, evidence that they're somehow broken, disconnected, less emotionally intelligent than people who seem to know exactly what they're feeling at all times. I want to be clear that this interpretation is almost never accurate. Emotional clarity isn't a fixed trait some people simply have and others simply lack. It's a skill, dependent on nervous system regulation, on available internal space, on years of practice that not everyone has had equal opportunity to develop, and on circumstances that can genuinely disrupt even well-developed emotional awareness when the underlying conditions, chronic stress, prolonged overwhelm, extended suppression, become significant enough. Losing this clarity temporarily doesn't mean you've lost some essential capacity. It means the conditions required to access that capacity have shifted, and conditions, unlike fixed traits, can shift back. Emotional clarity isn't a fixed trait some people simply have and others simply lack. It's a skill, dependent on nervous system regulation, on available internal space, on years of practice that not everyone has had equal opportunity to develop, and on circumstances that can genuinely disrupt even well-developed emotional awareness when the underlying conditions, chronic stress, prolonged overwhelm, extended suppression, become significant enough. Losing this clarity temporarily doesn't mean you've lost some essential capacity. It means the conditions required to access that capacity have shifted, and conditions, unlike fixed traits, can shift back. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding why this happens is only useful if it also shows you a genuine path back to yourself, one that doesn't require forcing clarity that isn't ready to arrive, but instead rebuilds the conditions that allow it to return naturally. The first thing worth understanding about rebuilding this clarity is that it cannot be forced through sheer analytical effort. And this trips up a lot of people who approach the problem the way they'd approach any other problem in their life, by thinking harder about it, by trying to reason their way into an answer. Emotional recognition doesn't respond well to this approach, because it isn't primarily a cognitive process. It's a somatic one, rooted in the body's signals. And trying to think your way into naming a feeling often produces exactly the kind of overthinking that pulls you further away from the actual sensation rather than closer to it. The first real shift, then, involves redirecting your attention away from the question, "What am I feeling?" and toward a much simpler, more physical question. What is happening in my body right now? Is there tightness somewhere? Is there heat or heaviness? Or a kind of hollow, empty quality? Is your breathing shallow or full? Starting here, with pure physical sensation rather than emotional labeling, often succeeds where direct labeling fails, because sensation is usually still accessible even when the language for naming the emotion attached to it has gone quiet. The second thing involves deliberately creating the internal quiet we discussed as one of the contributing causes of this disconnection in the first place. If constant external stimulation has been crowding out the space emotions need in order to surface and become recognizable, then rebuilding access requires deliberately, consistently protecting small windows of genuine quiet, not quiet filled with a different kind of stimulation like background music or a podcast, but actual unstimulated stillness, even just 5 or 10 minutes at a time, where nothing is competing for your attention. This might feel uncomfortable at first, precisely because that discomfort itself is often one of the reasons the constant stimulation developed in the first place. Quiet can feel unbearable when there's a backlog of unprocessed feeling waiting underneath it. But this discomfort is actually valuable information, not something to avoid entirely. It's a sign that quiet is finally doing its job, creating enough internal space for something real to start surfacing, even if what surfaces initially feels vague, uncomfortable, or difficult to fully name right away. The third thing worth practicing is expanding your emotional vocabulary deliberately, outside of the moments when you're actually trying to identify a feeling in real time, so that when a feeling does start to surface, you have more specific language available to meet it. Most people default to an extremely limited emotional vocabulary. Fine, okay, stressed, tired, upset, not because their emotional lives are actually that limited, but because they've never built out the more specific vocabulary that would allow for finer distinctions. Learning the difference between disappointment and hurt, between irritation and resentment, between anxiety and dread, between contentment and relief, gives your nervous system more precise categories to sort incoming signals into. And this precision itself often makes emotions easier to recognize, because a feeling that doesn't fit neatly into fine or not fine might fit quite clearly into a more specific category, once that category is actually available to you as an option. The fourth thing, and this one requires patience more than technique, is learning to tolerate the specific discomfort of not knowing, rather than rushing to fill that gap with a guessed label that doesn't actually match what's happening underneath. A lot of people, uncomfortable with the disorientation of not knowing what they feel, grab the nearest available label just to end the discomfort of uncertainty, saying, "I guess I'm just stressed," or "I guess I'm just tired," as a way of closing the question rather than actually answering it accurately. This premature labeling, while understandable, often short-circuits the more patient process that would eventually produce a genuinely accurate answer. Sometimes the most honest, most useful thing you can say, both to yourself and to people asking how you're doing, is simply, "I'm not sure yet. Something is happening, and I'm still figuring out what it is." This honesty, uncomfortable as it feels in a culture that expects quick, tidy answers to emotional questions, actually creates the space needed for genuine clarity to eventually emerge, rather than settling for a guess that closes the question without actually resolving it. The fifth thing worth understanding is how important it is to rebuild trust with your own internal signals gradually, through small, low-stakes practice, rather than expecting full clarity to return all at once in some dramatic breakthrough moment. This might look like checking in with yourself briefly, several times throughout an ordinary day, not during moments of crisis or significant emotional intensity, but during completely mundane moments, noticing, briefly, what you're feeling while making coffee, while walking somewhere, while sitting in a waiting room. These low-stakes check-ins matter because they rebuild the internal habit of listening without the pressure of needing to arrive at a perfectly accurate, immediately useful answer. Over time, this practice, repeated consistently, rebuilds the internal muscle that chronic suppression, stress, or overwhelm allowed to weaken, the same way any atrophied muscle rebuilds gradually through consistent, unglamorous, low-intensity practice rather than through a single dramatic effort. I want to say something important here about the relationship between this specific kind of healing and the people in your life. Because reconnecting with your own emotional clarity doesn't have to happen in complete isolation. And in fact, it often happens more effectively with some support. Even if that support simply looks like someone patient enough to sit with you while you're still in the "I don't know" phase, without pressuring you to produce an answer before you're actually ready to give one. Finding people who can tolerate your uncertainty without rushing you toward premature clarity, who can ask, "What's happening in your body right now?" instead of demanding an immediate emotional label, creates exactly the kind of patient, low-pressure environment that this specific rebuilding process actually requires. This is different from needing someone to fix the disconnection for you. It's simply about not having to do this particular work entirely alone, surrounded by people who understand that clarity is returning gradually rather than instantly, and who are willing to walk alongside that gradual process instead of expecting it to resolve on someone else's timeline. And here is something worth sitting with, something that I think reframes this entire experience in a way that actually matters. The fact that you've noticed this disconnection at all, that you're aware enough to recognize when you don't know what you're feeling, is itself a significant piece of the awareness you're worried you've lost. Someone genuinely, completely disconnected from their internal world wouldn't notice the absence of clarity in the first place, wouldn't be sitting with the specific discomfort of, I know something is happening and I can't name it, because that discomfort itself requires a baseline level of internal awareness that total disconnection simply doesn't produce. You haven't lost access entirely. You've lost fluency, temporarily, in a language you're clearly still capable of hearing, even if you can't yet translate everything it's telling you. That distinction matters enormously, because fluency, unlike capacity, can absolutely be rebuilt, given enough patient practice and enough of the internal quiet that rebuilding actually requires. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic moment where clarity suddenly floods back all at once, complete and fully formed, but something quieter, something that actually reflects how this specific kind of healing tends to unfold. Picture yourself, weeks or months from this exact moment, sitting in some ordinary, unremarkable setting and noticing, almost without deciding to, a feeling arriving with a name already attached to it, a small, specific word surfacing naturally, where before there would have only been static, only a blank, unreadable space where an answer should have been. Picture the quiet relief of that moment, not because the feeling itself is necessarily pleasant, but because you finally recognize it, finally have language for it, finally feel like you're back in conversation with your own internal world after a period of genuine, disorienting silence. Because that is the real, quiet truth beneath everything we've explored today. You didn't lose your feelings. You lost, temporarily, the fluency required to read them clearly, buried under suppression or stress or overwhelm, or simply too much external noise crowding out the internal quiet clarity actually requires. And fluency, unlike so many things people fear they've permanently lost, has a way of returning, slowly, unglamorously, one small, patient check-in at a time, until one ordinary day, without any dramatic announcement at all, you realize you know exactly what you're feeling again, and you're not entirely sure when, exactly, that quiet, unremarkable fluency finally, fully came back.